month shy of a year of a global health pandemic, the global GDP is expected to grow to 2.9% from the projected 3.3%. Africa is equally reeling from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, with its GDP shading 1.4 percentage points to 1.8 from the projected 3.2%. Now, while a vaccine is still a wait and see, all efforts to reopen economies are being shut down by COVID-19 cases resurgence, or worse still, a second wave of infection that has hit Europe and parts of Asia. What is the real state of the COVID-19 pandemic across Africa? What is the trickle-down effect of the economic slowdown that we are seeing, and how can resuscitation be induced into the African economy amid a resurgence? Hello there and welcome to the Pan-African edition of Meet the Press. This is Metropole Debrief and my name is Ndero Oganga. November has been the darkest month for Kenya since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in the country. In under 20 days, according to the Health Cabinet Secretary Mutahi Kagwe, the country has so far recorded 14,927 positive COVID-19 cases with 274 deaths. Out of the fatalities, 8 are frontline medical workers. Since the confirmation of the COVID-19 pandemic in Kenya in March, Kenya has so far recorded 70,804 COVID-19 cases, 1,287 deaths, and 46,244 recoveries. To the south of Kenya, the Tanzania's COVID-19 status is unknown, with the president constantly downplaying the severity of the disease, comparing it to common cold. Tanzania last reported its COVID-19 case on the 30th of March with 180 cases, and since then, it's been business as usual, with an election held and a packed-to-capacity swearing-in of President John Pombe Magufuli. The United States of America has since issued a travel advisory on the destination. Seychelles is among the few countries in the world yet to register fatality from the pandemic. The East African archipelago island has so far recorded 160 cases with 157 recoveries. The island that heavily relies on tourism has begun easing travel restrictions. From November 16th, travelers arriving from Cuba, Israel, Japan, Maldives, among others, will be permitted to enter Israel. From 12th November, all arriving passengers, irrespective of origin, need to present a recent negative COVID-19 test and test negative again on their 6th day in Seychelles. Further down the Indian Ocean, hospitals in Madagascar have been struggling to cope with a surge of COVID-19 cases. Cases in August quadrupled in the first month in the Indian Ocean island, with more than 13,000 infections and 162 deaths from coronavirus, which has spread to all but one of its 22 regions. Despite the spike, President Andry Rajoelina stands by the herbal concoction called COVID Organics, which was launched to great fanfare in April. It is produced by the Malagasy Institute of Applied Research from the Artemisia plant, the source of an ingredient used in malaria treatment, and other Malagasy plants. Now, that report is just a rough draft of what the COVID-19 numbers look like in the African continent. But what is the trickle-down effect of the pandemic? According to the World Bank biannual Africa's Pulse report, economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa will decline from 2.4% in 2019 to between negative 2.1% and negative 5.1% in 2020, depending on the success of measures taken to mitigate the pandemic's effects. Now, this means that the region will experience its first recession in 25 years. Now, what does this mean for various countries? Let's begin in Ghana, West Africa, where the hospitality industry is adversely impacted due to closure of borders and the general slowdown in tourism and demand for international travel. Remember, this is a country that in 2019 made $1.9 billion from their year of return campaign. There has also been decline in trading volumes and values due to disruption in global supply chain. Ghana, put together with Cote d'Ivoire, supplies 70% of the world cocoa beans. You can imagine what this has done to that economy. There has also been contraction in foreign direct investment inflows to Ghana due to uncertainties, okay? And also, the agriculture value chain could be adversely impacted due to disruptions in global supply chains and slowdown in demand as countries adjust to the new normal.
Cocoa farming in Ghana employs give or take 800,000 farmers. The impact on these families is about to be dire. The government is also expected to lose net revenue. What impact will this have on the GDP? Now, the impact on GDP's growth will be estimated at 6.8% to about 2.6% in 2020. So instead of 6.8%, it's down to 2%. Now, the biggest tornado hit Ghana in about March, April, May. We remember crude oil, the benchmark has always been $65 per barrel, but crude oil fell under $23 and Brent fell flat to zero and further dipped to negative territory. What's the estimated impact? Now, the shortfall in Ghana Stabilization Fund is set at 1 billion Ghanaian cedis. The Stabilization Fund is a fund that is set to cushion the national budget against the volatility of the oil market. We have the Heritage Fund, which is set to have fallen short of 453 million. The Heritage Fund is a sovereign fund where resources for the next generation are kept accrued from the current natural resources. There was also a shortfall in annual budget funding of about 3 billion Ghanaian cedis, and also transfers to the Ghana National Petroleum Commission fell by 642 million Ghanaian cedis. Now, there's also an estimated impact on tax revenue shortfalls. Now, we begin with import duties, which is at 808 million, oil tax revenues 1,446 million, and non-oil tax revenues is bigger than both put together at about 2 billion Ghanaian cedis. Now, this sort of paints a picture of what's going on. However, what's the real deal? What happens to economies when oil drips to the negative territory, or you don't get the money that you were hoping to get when you take it to the market? Negative oil shock prices account for about 8% of fluctuations in government spending, to mean they don't have money to allocate to various sectors. 20% of imports, you don't have money to import. 8% inflation because of the dollar exchange rates, and 2% real effect on exchange in the long run. As a result, the government revised budget approved by Parliament on the 7th of August forecasts a deficit of about 11.4% of the GDP in 2020, up from 4.7% in its initial budget. Economic growth is now projected at 0.9% compared to 6.8% forecast in November and 1.5% forecasted in March. This is the state of the economy in Ghana due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's cross over to our neighbors, Rwanda. Prior to the COVID-19 crisis, Rwanda had been experiencing a very strong macroeconomic fundamental, with GDP growth averaging 7.4% in the past 5 years and 8% in the past decade. Those are really good numbers, bearing in mind Kenya struggles at 5, 6, 7 is a good year for us. In 2019, the GDP grew by 9.4%, one of the highest rates of growth in Africa and in the world. Remember, only Rwanda and Ethiopia are the African countries that dance around the double-digit GDP growth. Now, growth is poised to decelerate to about 2% in 2020 due to both reduction of global and domestic demand and disruptions in supply. Now, what's the impact? The National Bank of Rwanda report from 30th of April says that there has been a significant slowdown in the services and industry sector, and that demand for loan is down by 10.6% in the first quarter of 2020. And remember, this is when the pandemic was just beginning. Imagine how it is in quarter 3 and quarter 4. When it comes to imports and exports, Rwanda's imports from China decreased by 23% from January to February and are highly likely to have decreased further. This will also affect exports, as over 70% of Rwandan exporters are also importers by themselves. Now, also in Rwanda, small and medium enterprises account for 41% of all private sector employment, as is in very many African countries. SMEs are about 98% of all enterprises and provide 84% of private sector employment. The IMF projection of the annual GDP for Rwanda shows that a change of around 3.5 will occur in 2020 and 6.7 in 2021. At least the recovery numbers look slightly stronger. However, in a survey done on the socio-economic impact of COVID-19 in Rwanda, 80% of respondents say they have depleted saving to pay for food, healthcare, and other expenses since February 2020. Another 80% of employed individuals have earned less pay than they did before the lockdown. Now, 80 is slightly higher because Kenya is estimated at about 65% who have taken pay cuts. That's how the East African region looks like if we go by Rwanda. Let's go down south to our neighbors in South Africa, where the overall GDP is expected to decline by at least 5.1% and up to 7.9% at the end of 2020 and recover slowly through to 2024. Now, South Africa has had a difficult run. The rand has weakened by 11% in the first 2 months of 2020, dragging down other SACCO members' currencies, and the rating credit agency Moody is expected to downgrade the country to a non-investment grade later in 2020. Now, government revenues have fallen by 3.5% in the optimistic scenario and 5.1% in the pessimistic scenario in 2020. This is attributed to the depressed economy as well as government expenditures growing at the same rate as before the COVID-19 pandemic, i.e. in the absence of our stimulus package. Now, this just shows you South Africa had problems before the COVID-19, and what the virus did is amplify these problems. Now, against this, government deficits increase key findings with respect to survey in recent years. Southern Africa has attracted most FDIs in the continent, but globally, UNCTAD expects that these inflows will fall by between 5 to 15%. Statistics South Africa reports that the largest contributor to this decline was motor vehicles. Parts and accessory outputs decreased by 98%. Metal products and machinery sector, where output decreased by 65.4%. The wood and woods product output decreased by 49.2%. And petroleum chemical product output decreased by 41.5%. The most important one, the food and beverage sector production decreased by 19.4%. So this is how these sectors have been affected by COVID and how their input and output has been affected by the disease. 98, 65, 49. What does this mean? It means that the official unemployment rate has been rising. It rose by 30.8% in the third quarter of 2020, the highest documented since the commencement of the quarters in 2008, after sliding to 23.3% in the second quarter of the year, with about 47,082 people losing their jobs in the optimistic scenario and 80,712 losing their jobs in the pessimistic scenario in 2020. This are just textbook economies. The numbers show over 2 million South Africans have lost their jobs. What does this translate to? Poverty levels have increased by 0.5 percentage points, about 264,510 households in the optimistic scenario, and about 0.66%, about 387,948 households in the pessimistic scenario in 2020, and more households will be vulnerable to these shocks. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the state of business across this African continent. GDPs falling, businesses are not doing well, SMEs are struggling and shutting down, people have taken pay cuts, people have lost jobs, poverty is set to rise. After the break, we are joined by Odelia Oforen-Tiamwa, Head of Business News, Joy News Ghana, Arnold Kwizera, news anchor and reporter at CNBC Africa in Rwanda, and he's also the content lead, and Edwin Naidu, senior writer, Sunday Independent South Africa, to put these numbers into context.